So we're going to talk about the inquiry into the accident that took place just less than a year ago now with an Airbus A320 operated by Germanwings in the French Alps. So this was on the 24th of March 2015. A few words on the context of the flight. It was a Barcelona-Düsseldorf flight that took off in the morning, and that earlier on in the morning, the crew did the Düsseldorf-Barcelona flight. On board the aircraft, there were 144 passengers of 17 different nationalities, and 6 crew members. The captain, the co-pilot, which was the pilot in function during that flight, and 4 cabin crew. The BEA published in May 2015, very shortly after the accident, a preliminary report. And in this preliminary report, we concluded that the co-pilot had intentionally adjusted the automatic pilot to command voluntarily the descent of the aircraft to collide with the terrain. So this is rather a special framework, special context, because very early in the inquiry process, the circumstances of the flight, the immediate causes of the accident were clearly understood, and these causes indicated that this was a voluntary illegal act. And this led to a legal inquiry being conducted, a legal investigation. The question arose, we put the question at least, as to the interest, the advantage of pursuing a safety inquiry as well, because logically this takes place on accidents for which there is no determination, no desire to create an accident. So then after thought, we thought that it would be useful to pursue this inquiry, this investigation, to try and identify what the safety measures, where safety measures could be improved. So the objectives that we set ourselves in continuing this inquiry was to try and understand the medical history of the pilot. We all know that the co-pilot suffered from serious mental disorders. So we sought to understand more precisely how and when these mental disorders developed, and in parallel with that, what the various stages in the process were in determining the ability, the medical capability of this particular pilot. We'll talk about that more in detail later on. And then we looked at the specific case of the history of this co-pilot. In addition to that, we also reflected on how a pilot suffering from mental disorder could could actually find himself at the controls of an aircraft of this nature. And so this led on to questions. So we started an international review on the scientific monitoring of pilots in different countries. And so all of this with the goal of trying to see whether it would be possible to propose measures to reduce the risk associated with this kind of scenario. So this leads me on to talk about the organization of the investigation. It was the BAE that was called on to lead this safety investigation. We had representatives from the BFU in terms of the state of immatriculation and the operation of the aircraft, being a German-operated aircraft, our Spanish colleagues from Kayak, to provide information on the preparation for the flight at the Barcelona stopover and the actual takeoff of the flight. We also brought in a conventional manner again with a number of technical advisors representing the aircraft and engine manufacturers to proceed with a certain number of, to provide a certain amount of data to help us in our investigation, and also the associated regulation authorities, in particular the American national security, aviation security bodies. We sought to extend our research to have a broader understanding of the medical certification system, and this led us to bring in accredited representatives from our English and American friends, and that meant we could access a certain amount of data on how things are operated in those terms in those countries. And we were able to access advice from medical experts in these various countries. We also got other countries involved in terms of medical experience, notably Israel, Canada, and Norway. And finally, more generally, we also looked beyond the aviation world to see what practices were in terms of aptitude of personnel who have responsibilities in safety-critical installations. And this led us to meet people entrusted with medical certification or medical aptitude with EDF, the French electricity generation company in France, especially to look at operators who are working in nuclear power stations to see what sort of approach they have. In a similar approach, we also consulted SNCF, the French railway company, to see how they dealt with they covered train drivers. So I'll hand over now to Arnaud, who will go into greater detail in how the investigation was conducted.
D'accord, merci. Bonjour.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Arnaud Desjardin, in charge of this safety inquiry. With my team, approximately 10 people from BEA and some foreign counterparts, German, Spanish, and technical advisors. Since the beginning of the inquiry, since the moment I went on the crash scene, all the way until the issuance of our safety recommendations, the purpose being to propose some new measures to protect ourselves in the future against this type of accidents. First, I would like to remind you of a few important milestones. The aircraft took off at 9 from Barcelona in Spain. This is UTC time. You should add 1 hour to get local time. The aircraft took off at 9 from Barcelona. 9:25 was near the French coast. Top left, you see a map of France, and lower left, you have the vertical profile of the flight with a dozen milestones I will tell you about in a moment. At 9:27 and 20 seconds, the aircraft levels off at its cruise altitude of 38,000 feet. Flight crew is then in contact with the en route control center of Marseille at 9:30. The last communication, radio communication between the flight crew and ATC is recorded. And controller says, direct Irmar, merci Germanwings, 18 Golf. Irmar is one navigation beacon you can see here illustrated on the map. 24 seconds after this last radio contact, the captain leaves the cockpit, leaving the co-pilot alone in the cockpit. 29 seconds after the captain left the cockpit, the co-pilot selects an altitude on the autopilot close to 0. This triggers a descent of the aircraft using the autopilot. To select an altitude close to 0, the co-pilot had to act on the altitude selection knob, which you can see here. This is the control panel of the autopilot. At 9:33 and 12 seconds, the aircraft is still descending. It's at 32,000 feet, and the co-pilot increases the speed target to 308 knots, acting now on the speed selection knob. And that demonstrates that the co-pilot is conscious because he is acting lucidly in the cockpit. About 30 seconds later, the Marseille ATC, noticing that the aircraft is not at its cleared altitude of 38,000 feet, contacts the flight to know more. The aircraft is flying now at 30,000 feet, and the co-pilot does not answer. Marseille ATC will call the aircraft 11 times on 3 different frequencies. All these tries will fail. The co-pilot will never answer. Approximately 45 seconds later, the captain has been out for 4 minutes and 4 seconds. The buzzer in the cockpit requesting cockpit access sounds. To request access to cockpit, there is a keyboard outside the cockpit where a code has to be entered. This generates a buzz on the cockpit top panel. The cockpit door switch on the center pedestal. If the switch is set to unlock, the door will be unlocked, and during the flight, the door stayed locked until the flight crashed. Approximately 30 seconds after access request, co-pilot increasing the speed target again, this time to 350 knots. This again demonstrates that the co-pilot is conscious because he is acting on the autopilot controls. At 9:35:32, the aircraft passes 23,000 feet, and noise of people knocking on the cockpit door are recorded on the CVR. This lasts for 3.5 minutes. So, during item 9 and 10, it does not appear on this curve. Several calls were made through the interphone system from the cabin to the cockpit, and these calls were not answered by the co-pilot either. So 3 minutes later, then a controller from French Air Defense contacts the flight 3 times. And again, the co-pilot did not answer. The aircraft passes 10,000 feet, still descending, and some very violent blows on the cockpit door are recorded at 9:40:41. Nearly 10 minutes after the beginning of descent, the GPWS, ground proximity warning system, sounds, and 25 seconds later, the aircraft collides with the terrain. To finish with the information on the flight recorders, I remind you, as already stated in the preliminary report of May 2015, that on the previous flight from Düsseldorf to Barcelona, the parameters appear on the flight recorder as well. And reviewing this data, it appears that when the co-pilot was alone in the cockpit, he did some similar altitude selections, but the aircraft was already descending, so this had no consequences on the vertical flight path. After having selected these similar altitudes, the co-pilot returned the altitude targets to some more consistent positions. So this is what we can remind you of the flight itself and the previous flight. Let's look into the elements that took place before the flight, and we'll see the various stages of the co-pilot's medical history. To be able to fly as a professional, and this goes for every country in the world, you have to obtain a medical certificate to certify your aptitude to fly, and this aptitude has to be maintained every year. There are several steps to this. First, you have to do an initial application for a medical certificate. In the case of the co-pilot, this was done in April 2008. He requested a medical certificate to the medical center at Lufthansa. He was declared able to fly, and a medical certificate was issued without limitations. And there, in September 2008, he started his initial training with the Lufthansa Training Center. Then came the first revalidation, 1 year after the first medical certificate was issued. The co-pilot suffered from a depressive period without any psychotic symptoms. Between August and July 2009, he interrupted his training in November 2008. He was taken antidepressants under supervision of a psychiatrist. So, April 2009, 1 year after the first medical certificate, the co-pilot requests a revalidation. On the revalidation form, he answers yes to hospital history. So the medical aptitude exam demonstrates this depression. So the certification is postponed until new inquiries. This opinion from a psychiatrist arrives in July 2009 and confirms that the depression period is over, so it is possible to recommend a new validation of the medical certification. This is done. The certification is renewed with a derogation stating a waiver, stating that it would become invalid if there were a relapse into depression. Then the yearly renewals. Co-pilot undergoes some new medical exams between 2010 and July 2014. Every time he's declared fit to fly, and his certificate is renewed for 1 year with the same waiver. These yearly exams include psychiatric and psychological assessments, and this is done by the examining doctor, who is not always a psychiatrist. In the general process of issuance of medical certificates, you have what we'll call here the principle of self-declaration. The regulations, and specifically in Germany at the time of the accident, imposes on the pilot, if his medical aptitude is not the same or changes, he should get an aeromedical certification if he starts taking medicine or if he suffers from incapacity or if he gets injured. So the co-pilot renewed his aptitude certificate for the last time in July 2014. In November 2014, he falls severely ill. He has some sleep and vision issues. In 2015, he was taking antidepressants and sleeping pills. Between 14 and 15, some doctors prescribed some sick leave. Parts of them were forwarded to Germanwings, his employer, and parts of them were not sent to Germanwings. And in particular, the day of the accident, the co-pilot should not have been flying. He had been stopped by his doctor. So this demonstrates that, according to the regulations, the co-pilot should have self-declared and should have obtained a new medical certificate before flying again, and this he did not do. So let's look in details what happened on the medical standpoint from November 2014. Some ophthalmologists were consulted for vision problems, and all these specialists concluded that there was no organic reason for the reported vision issues, though these were psychosomatic issues. The 17th of February 2015, a private physician referred the co-pilot to a psychiatrist and a psychotherapist. 24th of Feb 2015, the treating psychiatrist has prescribed some antidepressants. 10th of March 2015, the same private physician, same as 17th of February, diagnosed some possible psychiatric issue and directed him to a psychiatric hospital. The medical file of the co-pilot has been looked into by BEA and BFU, and the expertise of this was interested to a German psychiatrist and a German medical expert. They assessed the medical file and presented their conclusions to a team composed of French, English psychiatrists and one aeromedical medical expert from UK. This experts team conclusion was that the symptoms developed by the co-pilot between 2014 and March 2015 could be compatible with a psychotic depressive episode. So now we have some good knowledge of the medical history of the co-pilot. So how come the system could allow this co-pilot to fly when he was suffering from severe medical disorders and he was in command of an airline? So we can identify two main failures. First, the auto self-declaration process in case of a decrease in medical fitness between two periodical medical evaluations did not occur. Several private physicians had the information that the co-pilot was ill. Some knew he was flying, but this information did not reach the airworthiness authorities and did not reach his employer, Germanwings. So, more generally, let's look into the main protections that could avoid that a pilot suffering from severe mental disorder, how can we prevent him from putting an aircraft in a dangerous or hazardous situation? So now we'll discuss 5 main measures. The first one being the medical assessment itself. Medical assessment is designed to prevent mentally ill pilots from being in control of an airline. Second is the self-declaration process. As we said, it did not work in the case of this accident. We'll try to explain why it did not work and how we could make this self-declaration more effective. These 2 first principles are part of today's regulation. This is part MED These are mandatory measures. The other measures I will tell you about now are common sense or good practice, but they are not necessarily part of the regulations. First is the social environment, colleagues, support groups, peers, other pilots, family and friends. The fourth principle is private physicians, giving sick leave, is prescribing treatments, and also in some cases reporting to the authorities. And reporting to the authorities might prevent what happened. And then we'll discuss multi-pilot crew, because multi-pilot crew is also meant to guarantee that an incapacitated pilot, to prevent him from being in control of an aircraft and creating hazardous conditions. So analyzing each of these principles, each of these measures, we wanted to identify weaknesses and suggest ways of making them more efficient. The first principle I would like to tell you about today is the fourth one here, dealing with private physicians. Why? Why this one? But it's probably the most obvious one. There have been opportunities when private physicians had the information that the co-pilot was suffering severe mental disorders, and still authorities and the employer could have stopped the co-pilot from flying. So here we have to discuss medical secrecy. So let's be clear. We don't want to discuss the principle of medical non-disclosure. This is key for the trust between a doctor and his patients, to encourage people from asking medical advice and be sure that they have to be sure that their private information is protected. This benefits society as a whole. And this information is extremely well protected in most countries. The public health codes in France, and it's in the penal code in Germany, data protection code, General Medical Council in the UK. It's in the US as well. Article 199 of the Spanish Penal Code. We can see that medical secrecy, medical non-disclosure is quite protected, and there are sanctions for doctors breaking this without good reasons. And doctors could lose their rights to be a doctor, but they could have some severe legal consequences as well. But public interests sometimes could benefit from disclosure of this sort of information to protect society against serious hazards. And this exists. In all the countries participating, there are legal clauses stating that in case of immediate hazard or public security, there can be disclosure. In Germany and in France, these clauses are quite general, non-specific. In some other countries, as Canada, Israel, Norway, the doctors are compelled to disclose the information if they know that a pilot can be a threat to public safety, even without the consent of the pilot himself. It's not the case in Germany. The general provisions include all types of patients. Nothing is specific for pilots. So there is no formal definition of what could be an imminent danger or hazard and what is a threat to public safety, meaning the doctors are extremely careful. they do not communicate any medical information to the authorities in the absence of an obvious imminent danger. Not only are they really serious about the medical secret, but also they fear legal consequences, or they also afraid to lose their right to be doctors. And this is the conclusion we had from a group of French doctors. So I think that more specific, clearer regulations would be necessary to explain when doctors could be compelled to stop this medical secret in case of pilots or people carrying passengers. So this brings us to our first recommendation: balance between medical secret, confidentiality, and public safety. BEA requests the definition of clear rules to require healthcare providers to inform the authorities when a specific patient's health is very likely to impact public safety. The rules must protect the patient. We don't want to do without medical confidentiality, but healthcare providers should be protected as well to avoid them being taken to court when some information is passed on. And it has to protect public safety as well. We think it's a global issue. Several countries, everywhere, worldwide. This recommendation will first be sent to the World Health Organization, so we can define measures at the European level. It has to go to the European Commission, and without waiting for the implementation of these clauses or provisions in the European regulations, because this could take months or years, it will also be sent to the German Transport Ministry and to the German Doctors' Council. So that's us finished analyzing the first weaknesses about private doctors. The four other principles: medical assessment for the delivery or renewal or certifications.
So international standards defined by ICAO, indicate that the evaluation of pilots, the psychological condition of pilots, should be done annually through observing their behavior and through interviews conducted by an aeromedical examiner who is not necessarily a psychologist. So examples of the questions that may be put are of this type: do you feel discouraged? Have you any sleeping problems? Do you feel anxiety? Have you taken medicine recently? And so they're the same sort of interviews that are conducted pretty much everywhere around the world, and especially in the European countries, and especially at the Lufthansa Aeromedical Center. So if the answers to these questions generally arouse concern or worries from the medical examiner, then the physician will ask for additional analysis from specialists. So all the aeronautical medical experts, especially those from ASMA, the Aerospace Medical Association, but also the UK authorities, insist that psychological tests of a thorough nature for all pilots would not necessarily be useful or effective, but general interviews without the presence of a psychologist or a psychiatrist for pilots who already have a past medical history may be inadequate. And the European regulations don't provide for a specific provision to conduct these psychological evaluations for those pilots who have already, in the past, had mental disorders or incidences of depression. So the next recommendation, safety recommendation, is on the theme of medical evaluation of pilots with mental health issues. The BEA recommends that the conditions for follow-up for professional pilots with a history of psychological, psychiatric trouble of any sort, and these special conditions can, for example, be restriction in terms of the duration for the certificate. This could be maybe reduced to 6 months or 3 months. Or we could recommend special examinations conducted by psychiatrists or psychologists for pilots with a medical history of mental disorder. So this is something we're going to be addressing to EASA, the European Air Safety Agency. So hitherto we've talked about the two principles which leads to two themes of safety recommendations. Now the first one is the balance between medical secrecy and public safety, and the second, reinforcement of psychological evaluation of pilots on a yearly basis for where they've had a past history of mental disorder. So we can see that these two recommendations could lead on to negative effects. They could lead to pilots hiding their medical history, not just from the aeronautical physicians, but also from private physicians. This could lead to other risks being generated with sick pilots who avoid any medical consultation and any form of treatment because they fear that otherwise the physicians will denounce them, and this will lead to their right to fly being curtailed. So we seek to counterbalance the negative effects induced by these two first series of recommendations in terms of safety. In particular, we need to look at the principle of self-declaration. In this particular case, the principle did not work effectively. Why not? There are a number of barriers that can hinder this principle. First of all, when you suffer from mental disorders, you may well disconnect from reality, and it'll be difficult to understand yourself that you're no longer fit to fly. And above all, there can be social and economic consequences for a self-declaration in the event of in between two medical examinations. So you could lose your right to fly, and you lose a part of your salary. And in particular for pilots, they lose a certain amount of self-esteem in such instances. So that's why some airlines have already set up measures to attenuate these factors. This can be done through a loss of license insurance, for example. Lufthansa, for example, allows for this, allows for pilots to continue to benefit from a salary where they no longer fly for those mental health issues. In sectors other than aviation, we saw earlier that we took a look, we studied the French nuclear industry sector and the provisions adopted by the SNCF railway company. The agents running nuclear power stations, for example, who also need medical certification to exercise their profession, if they lose that medical aptitude, EDF offers them similar positions where they retain a similar salary. And you have a very similar, practically identical system for the SNCF train drivers. Finally, this is the third part of the presentation here, this slide, to favour self-declaration. There are systems to allow people to continue to follow treatment while still flying, but under certain conditions. Studies that go back to the to about 2000, the year 2001, or even before, state that in the event of close medical surveillance, this can be beneficial for flight safety. So this counteracts the fact that the pilots prefer to flight while still being depressive. while undergoing self-treatment. So they will not fear that the loss of their medical aptitude to fly. So in countries where these provisions are in place, in Australia, the United States, or in Canada, or the United Kingdom, the conditions are extremely strict. First of all, the medical certificates are only issued by the legal authority and not by the aeromedical centres. Secondly, depressive disorders can only be of a slight or moderate nature. The pilot's condition must remain stable with regular treatment without any secondary effects for a number of months before the pilot can again fly. The fourth point is that there have to be more regular medical consultations, more frequently than once a year. Finally, antidepressants from a defined list, a list defined by the authority, will be authorized. The European regulations do not clearly define such procedures, so that in countries like Germany and France, there has never been an issue of medical certificates for pilots who take antidepressants and so declare. But this is the case in the United Kingdom. So this leads us to the next series of safety recommendations on the theme of antidepressants and being fit to fly. The BA recommends that the European regulation define the procedures whereby pilots can be declared fit to fly while still taking antidepressant medications under medical supervision. This will be addressed to EASA again. Second recommendation to reinforce this principle of self-declaration concerns the attenuation and mitigation of the consequences of loss of license. So BA recommends that airlines include measures to mitigate socioeconomic risks related to a loss of license by one of their pilots for medical reasons. This is addressed to EASA to implement measures within their member states, and also IATA, the International Air Transport Association, for there to also be directives disseminated within the member airlines. Fourth principle that we're going to be exploring are what we call what refer to the social and economic environment that exists within the airlines. There are a number of programs within the airlines to provide assistance to pilots where they are in a state of emotional distress. And these programs, which we call peer support groups or support programs between peers, offer services for orientation, for guidance and advice in areas that are considered to be secure, where peers can settle problems between each other in a non-punitive fashion. This exists within Lufthansa, with the Mede Foundation, for example, but they are not always available with other operators, and they're not known to the pilots' families. But the pilots' families and those close to them are best placed to detect problems of fitness to fly. Also, these programs aren't always available for cultural issues that vary from one country to another. And also there are problems of constraints due to the size of the airlines, which makes it difficult to implement such a program. That's why the BEA recommend in terms of promoting pilot support programs, to promote the implementation of peer support groups, to provide a process for pilots, their families and peers the opportunity to report and discuss mental health issues with the assurance that pilots will be supported, guided and provided with necessary help. This too is to be addressed to EASA. last principle to be analysed is with the multi-pilot crew. Generally, airline aircraft are flown with two crews. This is what happens with the modern airline aircraft. What happens in terms of the inability of one of the pilots? The other pilot will take up all the piloting role to continue to fly the aircraft in complete safety. So this principle only works if the second pilot is effectively within the cockpit. Now, he may leave the cockpit to settle a problem in the passenger cabin or simply to go to the toilet. That's why there's an emergency code system to be entered on the keypad in front of on the door of the cabin to unlock the door, where the pilot alone in the aircraft, in the cockpit, encounters a problem. Or he becomes unfit to fly for one reason or another. So this principle for two pilots being in the cockpit is a good way to settle problems of physical problems, but it's not a solution to the problem of pilots with suicidal tendencies. There have been, for example, accidents involving pilots who wanted to commit suicide when piloting an airline, and they managed to do this despite the presence of a pilot alongside them. We can mention, for example, the accident that took place in February 1982 of a DC-8 of Japan Airlines in Japan. We could mention the accident that occurred in June 1994 with an Enter of Royal Air Maroc, and an accident that took place in October 1999 of a Boeing 777 from Egypt Air. So you can see that having a system that allows you to open the door from the outside, in addition to this code system, would not be adequate to cover all the risks related to suicidal pilots. This would create, clearly, additional safety risks. I'd remind you that the bulletproof system on the cockpit doors were designed after the terrorist attacks of 11 September 2001. So we feared that malicious, malevolent acts could occur from people from the passenger cabin. So we set a cursor between safety and on safety matters so as to design doors that would resist a threat coming from the outside of the cockpit. So during this accident, the threat was within the cockpit and not outside it. So we can see that you can't design a system to lock the door, allowing you to prevent threats both from the outside of the cockpit and also within the cockpit. The last topic I wanted to address today. During the investigation, we had difficulties gathering information on incidents or accidents of a similar nature to do with pilots having mental disorders. This can be explained by a number of factors. The first being that there's a certain reticence to report on this sort of event. There's a kind of a taboo on the question of mental health for pilots, and very few safety investigations that have been conducted into the matter so far. There are also problems of legal proceedings underway which block access to a certain amount of data, and there are also restrictions related to medical secrecy. But it would seem important to improve our knowledge at a European level of the number of incapacities related to mental health problems, and this would help us to analyze these events and possibly improve the medical examination criteria. That's why, on this theme, we recommend that regular analyses be conducted for in-flight capability, to encourage colleagues to give data to validate the capacity, and also this too will be put forward to EASA. So, in total, the BEA is going to be is issuing today 11 recommendations, safety recommendations, on the systems that I've been talking about until now. Mr. Director, would you perhaps like to conclude? Just a few words by way of a conclusion before moving on to questions. On these recommendations, you saw that we identified a certain number of barriers that are intended to protect against this sort of scenario. We identified that these barriers all had weaknesses, so we put forward a certain number of recommendations to try to improve the effectiveness of these barriers. Improving effectiveness is what I'm saying. I'm not saying that we're going to make these barriers completely foolproof, completely 100% effective. It really involves handling failures, human failings, failings of the pilot who has been entrusted with a very major part of the safety of the flights. So we're aware that these recommendations can improve safety if they're implemented, but we can't in any way suggest that this is going to be an absolutely 100% effective barrier in all instances. The second point on which I'd like to insist by way of a conclusion is to say that we need to take these recommendations as a whole. Arnaud talked about a certain number of the recommendations which looked at how to tighten medical surveillance of pilots, make it more stringent, and allow physicians to forward information on the medical history of the pilots to the authority. This can have secondary effects, though, which it may lead the pilot no longer to consult and to hide from the authorities, the aeromedical authorities and medicine in general, their problems, and self-administer medications and so on. So we need to look at the possibility of flying under certain conditions while taking antidepressants, and look at proposals to set up the promotion of support programs for pilots, where mitigation of the consequences in socio-economic terms would help the pilots facing such difficult situations when they start to face these problems, for them to be able to consult, to be treated in full confidence. And that way we would avoid encountering situations where the pilot is in a complete impasse, a complete dead-end situation, and where he's led to risks the lives of others, and where he can also lose his what's dearest to him, and that is his license as a pilot. So the report is going to be put online within a few minutes on the BA's website in 4 languages: in English, French, Spanish, and German. Any questions? Thierry Vigouroux, maybe? Sorry, without the microphone. So EASA has issued a certain number of recommendations. There are some recommendations that EASA has issued that we haven't taken up because the actions are already in process, and EASA is the legitimate body to pursue that. And these are rules relating to how people in the cockpit are controlled. EASA has also issued recommendations that go beyond the pure issue of the scenario of our accident, and especially the recommendation relating to random testing for illegal drugs and alcohol. Finally, EASA has formulated some recommendations of a general without necessarily clearly identifying the recipients, the targets. And we're formulating recommendations which are slightly more precise and which will directly address clearly identified targets, recipients. And the strength of the BEA's recommendations is that they're going to be made officially as part of a public report, and the recipients of the report, given that the report is public, will be led to pronounce clearly on these issues. What do you mean by safety within the cockpit? It's a question about unlocking of the cockpit door. On the design of the door, we recommend no change. I'd remind you that the design of the door aims to protect the cockpit against intrusions that would come from the cabin, from the passenger cabin. So we considered that the risk of a terrorist, let's be clear about that, is always present. I think the news at present proves that. But the main thing is to protect the cockpit against the terrorist potential in the passenger cabin. The rule is to always have two people in the cockpit, the gentleman is saying, without talking to the microphone. This is a rule this is a recommendation that was issued by EASA for airlines. This is a practice that certain airlines had already adopted. We think that, and EASA said so, that we need to implement that with a certain number of precautions. We need a second person to come into the cockpit to replace a pilot coming out. This has to be someone who is correctly selected. You have to have confidence in them. You mustn't introduce the risk of a malevolent act. That person has to be adequately trained to know what they have to do, what we expect of them in terms of conduct. But this measure is going in the right direction in safety terms. But we need to remember that we can't. This is not going to systematically prevent suicide attempts. As we said, there have been several cases of pilots intentionally crashing aircraft, despite the fact that the co-pilot, the other pilot, tried to prevent them from doing so. Have you knowledge of other European authorities or airlines implementing some of the conclusions you're talking about, especially Lufthansa? No, our recommendations are made public today. So if some people have already implemented them, that's good to see they're implementing our recommendations. Looking at Lufthansa's work on medical matters, our conclusions look at medical aptitude in regulation terms. This is something which comes under state control. There could be confusion. We talked about aeromedical examinations of pilots at Lufthansa Aeromedical Center. You need to remember that this aeromedical center is one that was qualified to act on behalf of the German authority. Do you know of any improvements that have already been implemented without waiting for the conclusions of the present report in terms of psychological and psychiatric measures? No, I can't answer that. Tim Heath, could you give us a bit more information on the private physicians that recommended a treatment in psychiatric hospital? Was it a psychiatrist, a private physician? What more can you tell us about that? And what does the regulation say, the German regulation say on that matter? How can it be that a physician recommends treatment in a psychiatric hospital and and does not feel obliged to inform his employer or the authorities. I'll answer the second part of the question, and then I'll hand over to Arnaud to answer the first part. On the second, I think we've already talked about this during the presentation. It's all about medical secrecy. A psychiatrist, like any medical professional, is required to respect medical secrecy. And this is, but in Germany, as in France, there are general rules that are not specific to medicine, where there's the need to have a balance between a regulation requirement, as with medical secrecy, and taking another form of action. But it's such a general recommendation in Germany and in France that most physicians feel very reticent, very reluctant to take the initiative of divulging medical secrecy. And I should add that we asked to interview the physician concerned who was treating this particular co-pilot, and this request was refused, so we did not have access to information directly from them. Well, as to who the psychiatrist was who asked the pilot to be admitted to hospital, to gain admittance to hospital, maybe Arnaud, you could add something on that. This happened in March 2015. It wasn't a psychiatrist that was concerned here. It was a GP that the co-pilot consulted on a fairly regular basis. But it is this physician who diagnosed possible psychosis and recommended admittance to hospital and to admittance to psychiatric hospital.
qui posent un risque de l'insomnie, enfin, ça peut être d'autres troubles liés à l'incapacité et qui pourraient partager dans ces recommandations sur ce plan.
Yes, this could go beyond psychiatric issues, and this is where it's difficult to really understand this sort of threat. Its immediate risk is cardiovascular issues. A pilot suffering from heart problems, for instance, could be in a situation that he might be a risk to flight safety. And cardiovascular issues, well, you could imagine that the risk would be physical incapacity. And the system of having two crew members in the cockpit is quite adapted. Süddeutsche Zeitung, you suggested some changes in the regulations. It's from your observations, but according to the existing regulations with the present system, can we identify some guilty parties or some parties that did commit some clear mistakes? Did any party break rules or make errors that in a way could have helped the co-pilot in committing his crime? I remind you that, as I said during my introduction, that the safety inquiry leading to the report we just published is not aiming to answer this question. Do we have one guilty party, and if so, who is he? For the second part of your question, have some rules been broken? Well, lurking behind this question, you have the issue of guiltiness, and we were more concerned on how do we improve safety. We didn't go very far in our investigations there, but what I can say, and it's in the report as well, is that the medical assessment process which this co-pilot underwent during his professional career was generally consistent with the German regulations at that time. Angela Schalten from APH, say 2 questions. First, was he under antidepressants, specifically citalopram, the day of the flight? Second question, could you go on, tell us more on your communication with FAA? Because apparently he lied the first time he filled his form, and FAA gave him a second chance. So we know that the co-pilot was taking antidepressants. We had access to the prescriptions in his medical file. We know what was prescribed. On the other hand, toxicology inquiries on the pilot's body did confirm traces of these products as well. I don't want to go into this sort of details. I don't think it's useful and will serve the safety inquiry. He was taking antidepressants, and that's enough to know that, well, we know he was ill. 2, we know he was taking antidepressants. I understand what you mean, secondary effects, side effects. To answer this question, we should know the type of antidepressants he was taking and also what quantities were found in his body at the time of the accident. And we have some technical problems. We did not wish to go more into details into this because, again, we want to identify the possible improvements in a general way, not specifically for this co-pilot. I think you had a second question involving the FAA. It's true that during when he was training in the US, he applied to the FAA to obtain medical aptitude to fly as a private pilot. And during this medical certificate request, the initial one, he did not state that in the past he suffered from depression. Now, there have been some exchanges between him and the FAA. Questions were asked, and to obtain his medical certificate, he was led to communicate to the FAA the medical assessment that had been done some month or for the European certificate he had obtained. And based on this, the FAA issued a Class 3 medical certificate. I work for a Japanese newspaper. My question deals with the co-pilot illness. Do you have anything about the origin of this illness? No. No, we don't have any precise information on the origin of the illness, if you were thinking in terms of medical cause or family issues. Christian Sugar from Futter Allgemeine, your inquiry addresses pilots flying today. But there's another community, the pilot candidates, non-pilots to be. Wouldn't it be reasonable to have some stricter rules for the pilot candidates and try to screen people who had psychiatric issues, not flying yet and prevent them from flying? Wouldn't it be reasonable to think of other rules? Because pilots already flying, I understand, you have to avoid them from hiding their medical issues. But for those not yet flying, before I answer that question, I'd like to make a quick remark. The co-pilot for this accident, from what we know, the first depressive symptoms occurred after he was in the air system. He had, when depression started, training was better, worked, and then he renewed with waivers. You told us about one depression in 2008. Yes, but at this time, he already had obtained a certificate before this depression. He already had a professional pilot medical certificate. He was not flying yet, but he was already in the training courses. So to give a general answer to your question, if you want to ask the question of should the screening be tightened for the pilots to be, or people contemplating a pilot's career. In the case of this co-pilot, he applied in 2008, before he was ill. To give a general answer to this question, on one hand, today, someone who wants to become a pilot must answer a question form, and within this, there are questions on psychological incidents history. And it's, as we said, difficult. Can you expect people to self-declare this in a reliable way or not? This type of history, when it's declared, of course, will trigger a specific psychological examination, more stringent than if he hadn't declared that. If you want to ask the question of reinforcing the screen for would-be pilots, for all pilot candidates, the psychological assessment should be reinforced, have a battery of tests that would go much more into details. At BEA, we are not doctors. We are not psychiatrists either. So we took lots of people's opinions, and all the specialists we asked told us that it would not be feasible, and if it was, it wouldn't be efficient. And that's the conclusion we are stating in our report. Good morning, NHK Television. Coming back to the flight history, you told us that there was an attempt on the previous flight, the flight before the one that crashed. Do you have any recommendations for the FCU that probably would report this sort of attempt? And the first attempt failed because the autopilot was on, but did you have any recommendations that could prevent this type of mischiefs? So why did this attempt fail? It's not because the aircraft was already descending. It's when the captain came back into the cockpit a few seconds earlier, the co-pilot changed the autopilot setting and tuned the target altitude to its normal values. If the co-pilot has stayed locked in the cockpit with the 100 feet target altitude, the accident could have occurred during the first flight. Could we recommend ground monitoring of this type of parameter, maybe in the aircraft computer system that could report to ground? Well, this is being deployed the purpose of this, of transmitting this information to ground systems is not to deal with this type of scenarios. It's to make it possible for ATC to anticipate future situations of the aircraft. And in the case of target altitude, the target altitude that has been set into the aircraft would make it possible to the ATC to maybe clear another aircraft who will go near it and the ATC would know that on the vertical situation it would work. So it's not meant to avoid this type of scenario. Why? Because even if for this type of scenario you see this altitude, what can happen? ATC cannot reprogram the autopilot. The system has not been designed for this. ATC might ask the pilot, what is this altitude target you've set? And then we don't know what would have happened. Catherine Field, Isola Media. Could you give us an English answer on my question, please? On my question. And the other ones, if you want to.
Authorities, and we noted that some countries already have practices which seems to be more or less in line with this recommendation. So we know that at least in some countries there is evidence that this is feasible. Now this is an area where you probably have understood that it is also linked to the culture and maybe the history of the country. So maybe it is this recommendation maybe will be more difficult to implement in some countries.
So you are having problems why you say that it's going to be more difficult. You have that resistance. So
I think it's too early to say that there will be resistance, but we note that, for example, in Germany, the doctors, and in France too, the doctors are very much attached to this, to having a strong principle of medical secrecy. But I hope that nevertheless there will be some moves there.
Thank you.
D'autres questions?
Other questions? No. Well, if you don't have any more questions, thank you.